So the seal walks into a bar. It is working. Welcome to the Happy Birthday Bill Celebration and National Federation of Local Cable Programmers Conference. Very delighted to have you all joining us today. We are celebrating at this conference 200 years of the U.S. Bill of Rights, with a particular emphasis on that First Amendment. We are also celebrating 20 years of public access television this year, as well as 15 years of the organization NFLCP, the National Federation of Local Cable Programmers. We are also celebrating a year and a half of MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television, and what a year and a half it has been. You'll be hearing a lot about the 750-some people who received basic training in that year and a half from our 2.0 full-time employee staff, actually a 3-person staff. In any event, I'm part of that staff. My name's Randy Ammon, and I'm the executive director at MCAT. I'm also the perennial vice chair of the Northwest region, the Dan Quayle, if you will, of the region board of directors of NFLCP. The success of MCAT thus far is based on many factors. A lot of the work that has gone on at access centers in the last 20 years, we looked around and we pulled the best examples, the best paperwork, we picked the best minds to set things up. We also have a unique spirit in this community. You may have discovered that. A very diverse, a very culturally aware community here in Montana. And enlightened city officials over the years played a large part in getting MCAT up and going and the success thus far. One of those enlightened city officials, a guy named Dan Kemmis, who is our mayor, is going to officially welcome you to town. I do want to mention, though, that in a Harper's magazine earlier this year, Dan was part of a panel speaking about titled "Who Owes What to Whom." It ties in very well with the bicentennial of the Bill of Rights. And at this point, I'd like you to welcome Mayor Dan Kemmis.
Thank you, Randy. Anyone who has any doubts about the commitment of Missoula to freedom of expression has only to look at Randy's shirt to It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, and not only because you offered to feed me. I get a chance to welcome all sorts of people. Right next door here, there's the annual meeting of the State of Montana Mosquito and Vector Control Organization. I welcomed them here yesterday. I feel somehow that I might have more to say to you than I have to say to the mosquito and vector control people. Not that their work is any less important, but it's less understood by me, at least, than some of what you do. It's been a real pleasure for me to have been involved in that phase of Missoula city government when we actually brought to fruition the establishment of a public access channel. And along those lines, I would like to acknowledge and honor my predecessor on the city council who had a great deal to do with that, Jack Schomer, who is back here in town with us again today. And Jack, I'm very glad to have you here, but also glad to be able to acknowledge the contribution you made through many frustrating years of negotiating with the main cable provider until we finally were able to get the franchise in place, and then to encourage the establishment of what became MCAT, and now to enjoy these first few months and years of what I am convinced is going to be one of the most exciting and fruitful public and private ventures that Missoula has been engaged in. I've been excited about this prospect from the first that I knew anything about it. I'm more excited about it every week that I hear about the number of Missoulians who are taking up with this. But just because you're not the mosquito control group, you're going to have to hear just a couple more words of welcome. And since you are a group of people who are committed to the provocative, I thought that it was somehow my obligation to be provocative as well. So I just want to say a few words about celebrations of bicentennials. We are now sort of working our way to the end of a series of celebrations of the bicentennial of the Constitution. I was struck during the time when we were actually celebrating the bicentennial of the Constitution itself by how generally mindless and unreflective that celebration seemed to have been. For a nation that prides itself on public discussion and public discourse, I would have expected that we would have gotten a little bit deeper into it and might even have raised some hard questions for ourselves in the course of celebrating the Constitution. I found that very rarely to have been the case. I'm afraid it is also likely to be the case with the celebration of the Bill of Rights. There are all kinds of ways of celebrating the Bill of Rights that I think do nothing more than make us feel good. And not that there's anything wrong with feeling good. I'm a great believer in that. But I also think that by the nature of the Bill of Rights and by the nature of what you're here to celebrate, that our celebration should go beyond that. And that's why I was delighted to be invited by Harper's Magazine to participate in this forum about a year ago, where the topic was whether we should have a Bill of Duties to balance the Bill of Rights. Harper's goes out of their way to set up these forums in interesting places. So in our case, they invited us to Independence Hall, and we sat upstairs from where the Constitution had been drafted, actually sat around John Marshall's library table in his library chairs, and for 3 hours engaged in what I found to be the most stimulating conversation I've ever been a part of about the issue of rights versus responsibilities, or how they relate to each other. Frankly, I think it's a central issue for public access. Because while there is undoubtedly great value in thinking of the Bill of Rights simply in the way in which it provides individuals with liberties, I am absolutely convinced that had that been all there was to it, had it ever been simply the question of whether people, individuals, should be free to speak and write their minds, that we would not have a Bill of Rights. There was always more to it than that. There was always the thought that somehow in being given the freedom to speak and to write, that we were therefore contributing to a larger good that reaches beyond the good of individuals. That's something that I think we have, in fact, largely lost sight of in our society. And we have come and will therefore spend most of the celebration of the Bill of Rights in celebrating nothing but raw individual freedom, and will not look beyond that to the fact that what those freedoms were always all about was the way in which they would contribute to the larger public good. The reason I think that that's interesting from the perspective of community access programming is that there is, of course, a large contingent, and ought to be, of people who are interested in that simply for the expression of individual points of view. And that's necessary, it's an interesting part of it. But frankly, from the point of view of a public official, if that was all that was going to happen, then it would not be worth the hassle. And believe me, there's plenty of hassle that goes with community access television. You know that. There's plenty of hassle for any public official that is involved in it. If I did not believe that community access was going to do more than give people a soapbox for their own individual gratification, then I would not be as committed to it as I am. The great opportunity that I see in community access programming is that it builds community. And that, I believe, is a vast and tremendously exciting potential. And it's something that I am deeply grateful to MCAT for providing us the opportunity to do. And I encourage them to continue to think of that side of this opportunity, and I encourage all of you to do that. But while I'm encouraging you, let me say that you have a wonderful program set up here. I'm sure that it's going to be very stimulating. But I think that any good meeting like this has to have an insurrection somewhere, so let me offer the insurrection. Whenever you come to some point on the program that you think, well, I've really had enough, I can do without that, wander out here and take a walk on Missoula's riverfront, which we are insanely proud of what we have done with the riverfront in Missoula. Get to know it a little bit, and we think that you'll understand why we're as proud of it as we are. And then when you get done this evening, let me invite you to an early celebration of October, where we've got good weather now. We're not going to take any chances with it. We're going to celebrate Oktoberfest tonight and tomorrow night in Missoula. There will be a street dance down at the north end of Higgins Avenue on both nights. It's one of the most marvelous community events you'll ever have a chance to be a part of. So come down and enjoy yourselves, and welcome, a warm welcome to Missoula.
Thank you, Mayor. The Oktoberfest celebration is just outside the MCAT studio, where we will be conducting tours late in this afternoon. It all works out well. We do have some other special guests I'd like to recognize here, starting with the National Federation of Local Cable Programmers Northwest Board of Directors, folks with the little blue ribbons, and if I can embarrass them to stand up, please. We have our chair, Brian Gertman, and our treasurer, Tom Taylor, our secretary, Patty Leahy, our public policy chair, Alan Bouchon, our conference planning chair, John Glasgow, and our organizational development chair, Carol Burns. Our Informational Services Chair, Paul Simon. And who am I missing? Robert Swanson and Pete Belcastro cannot be with us at this time. But anyway, these are good folks. Search out the blue ribbons and talk to these people. The NFLCP is the one organization that has made it possible that everyone in a community with Access TV has that access to the electronic media, has that, that community has that forum, so a good group. We also have several representatives from the National Board of Directors are from the Northwest. I don't know if Julie Omelchuk is in yet, or Paula Manley. They'll be joining us later in the day. We also have some green ribboned individuals who are the board and staff of Missoula Community Access Television. And if at this point I could ask all the MCAT board folks to stand up. We'll point at their heads back. These are the first folks, pick their brains as to where to go for ice cream, where to, that's local beer also down near the MCAT studio. I'd also like to introduce someone who will be coming on the City Council here in Missoula, Council-elect Chris Gingarelli. Welcome. At this point, I don't know if there are any other city folks out today, mainly because even as we speak at City Hall, there are negotiations going on with Rattlesnake Cable that's tying up the Cable TV committee of our City Council, and the president of the MCAT board, who ordinarily would be welcoming you on behalf of MCAT, Ron Wheeler. They'll be joining us later today. Interesting negotiations. They've been going on for years with Rattlesnake Cable, the owner of which has a particular view of the First Amendment that goes something like this: everyone should have freedom of speech, everyone should go out and buy their own cable company and control these channels. Bash, fun as it may be, tempting as it may be. At this point, I also should introduce some folks who have served on the National Board of Directors for NFLCP, starting with the aforementioned Jack Schomer and the Shum and Tom Taylor. And as always, if I'm forgetting anything or making mistakes, this is Access. Call out names. Let me share information. I'd like to go through briefly the conference preview, a rundown of what you may expect. As we're doing this, I would invite you to go through our lovely buffet line, starting with our center table here, and then maybe working clockwise around the room. So I'll keep talking as you start eating. Happy Birthday Bill of Rights is the name we came up with to represent a celebration. We don't want to take ourselves too seriously, but obviously this is a very important concept. Later at this session, we'll be hearing from Professor Michael Mayer from the University of Montana, speaking on censorship in the law. The workshop tracks begin at 2 p.m. today, divided into 3 separate tracks of workshops. The first is geared towards community video producers, and we'll be meeting in the Lewis room, just behind the buffet. The second track is geared towards representatives of nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, and local government, and they will be meeting, all those sessions will be in the Clark room, just down from the Lewis room, makes sense. And the third track is geared towards Access Center boards and staff. Those meetings will be in the Canyon room, which is across the lobby. We set up these tracks solely as a guideline. We encourage you to switch streams in the middle of the horse and pick out what you would like best, what would be most beneficial. For the 2 p.m. sessions today, we start off with, in track A, field production tips. It says here, improve your out-of-studio video projects with advice from the pros. We have some wonderful professionals among us here, including Steve Medlin, Frank Mason, and Pete Talbot will be doing that panel. In the B track, we have the value of access, Carol Burns and John Glasgow. And in this track, we'll be talking a lot about the Best of the Northwest Festival. We've covered 5 years of Best of the Northwest. Carol has some, I think, marvelous ideas for refining that, for making that awards ceremony and the award itself more apropos for community producers. And the third session at the 2 o'clock time today is Access Center Informational Exchange. Jacqueline Schumer and myself will be facilitating that. This is something I've wanted to do for a while to just get Access Center managers and staff primarily together, anyone who's interested, to talk about what books do you have available, what magazines, forums, promotional items, things along those lines. At 3:30 today, we have track A, Engineering for Non-Engineers, with Brian Gertman and Ray Larson. What every producer, Access Center, what everyone in this room should know about the TV signal and basic technology. We also have the B-Track, Libraries and Access, a case study of Missoula Public Library with Dave Pauley, Library Director, and Betty Ammon, Library Employee and volunteer producer, and wife, as the Independent pointed out. This is a case study designed for anyone who's interested in getting your institution, your nonprofit organization, educational institution, involved with community TV. It's a good case study. Good for libraries, good for Access staff who want to work more closely with libraries. We're very pleased that the library here is cooperating as much as they are. And also at 3:30 today, our Trainers Roundtable, facilitated by Mary Canty, MCAT Assistant Director, and Gary Hill. And that will be a sharing of information or training. Anyone who has ever tried to teach someone how to run a camcorder or the concept of Access television, please come and share your ideas. The tours to MCAT will start around 4:45 at the conclusion of today's second workshop session. There will be a bus out in front of the lobby, although with the weather like this here in tropical Montana, you may choose to walk. We will be have the bus available to take folks over there. We'd love you to see the facility and round up some refreshments for you, and you'll be right down there for the Oktoberfest. Tonight, dinner is on your own. We can offer a suggestion for folks who may not be part of a group who may want to. The Shack has placed a coupon in your goodie bags, which you get when you register, for I believe 20% off, and they've agreed to open their large back room with a big community table. So anyone who wants to join a group of NFLCP types, invite you out to the Shack for dinner. Tomorrow, and we'll go a little more quickly here, we've got, I should mention, we have videotape viewing set up in the Russell room at all hours. VHS, Super VHS, or 3/4-inch tapes. If you've brought your tapes and corral people, that's the place to see. And just stop by, who knows what you'll see running in there. And I see Julie Melchuk in the back. Welcome back to Missoula, Julie. The continental breakfast tomorrow starts at 8:15 here in the bitter room with table topics. There will be signs up on the table along the lines of equipment, public policy, government access to enjoy your Danish and coffee with like-minded individuals. Much of the benefit of this conference is just getting people together and having enough time to talk, to get into a dialogue about what's going on in your life, in your community, share ideas. The workshops begin tomorrow at 9:30 with audio for video, Jack Schomer. At the same time, Access Basics for Nonprofit Organizations, getting involved with Eric Station and Ron Wheeler. And Board Basics, what every board member should know, with Carol Walters and Barbara Milhouse as moderator. At 11 o'clock tomorrow, we have a video career exploration that McCarthy Coyle will be moderating. We've got a list of folks, including Frank Mason, Steve Medlin, Jackie Schomer, to talk about primarily alternatives to traditional broadcast television. For our producers in particular, there's a lot going on in video that's not quite traditional, not as conventional as it was just a decade ago. Also, video in the classroom tomorrow at 11 a.m. Tammy Rose, Dave Severson, and Marty Welch talking about alternatives to Whittle, talking about what's going on with educational institutions from elementary school through the college, university level. And then Video as Art, moderated by Laura Millen, with Paul Hart, Patty Leahy, and Rick Phillips, an exploration of some video art stuff. Lunch tomorrow, we're turning you loose on downtown Missoula. Resume for workshops at 2 p.m. with the Wildlife Film and Video Making workshop. Missoula has a reputation as a center for wildlife film, for environmental filmmaking. We host the International Wildlife Film Festival each year. The folks who put that together are on hand to teach anyone who wants to techniques and theory of wildlife film and video making. And they are Lori Hudak, Chuck Jonkel, and Bruce Whitey. We also have at 2 p.m. an overview of government access with Glenn Lipsker from Spokane and Paul Simon from Pocatello. And unfortunately, we had scheduled the Native American Programming Showcase. I say unfortunately because our panel that seemed firm at the beginning of the week all have out-of-state commitments. And this is personally distressing. I'm really looking forward to this. I do want to announce, though, that Roy Big Crane, who was going to be here, was the co-producer of a video entitled The Place of Falling Waters. Roy has been nominated for Native American Filmmaker of the Year and has been invited, along with Tom Smith and Frank Tyro, Salish Kootenai College, to attend a session in Estonia, in the Soviet Union. There will be a benefit screening of Place of the Falling Waters Sunday afternoon at 1 and again at 3 at the Crystal Theater, a benefit to raise money so these folks can go there, and I encourage your attendance at that. Our last round of workshops tomorrow at 3:30 continue with the Wildlife Film and Video Making session. That's a double session. We also have a case study of the Age-Wise program with Tom Taylor, a marvelous series produced by seniors, but a good case study for any nonprofit organization, anyone interested in getting involved. We also then have the highly awaited public policy update. Joe Van Eaton from Washington, D.C. will be joining Alan Bouchon in that one. There's some real heavy stuff coming down, particularly with the preferred case, as Alan described it this morning, the whole enchilada case, the future of all our access centers and most of our access may ride or heading into the Ninth Circuit Court. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., we invite you to participate in the no-host cocktail hour in the Lewis and Clark rooms that precedes our Happy Birthday Bill banquet. Joe Van Eaton will be our keynote speaker. For those of you who do not know Joe, let me just say that he is an attorney at law with Spiegel and McDermott. He's also a hero in community access circles and a good First Amendment attorney who speaks English. He will be delivering the keynote. Immediately following our banquet, we will be going into the First Amendment dance with big band music, and that's band B-A-N-N-E-D, your favorite dance tunes that have been censored over the years, or performers who have been the targets of censorship. Tim Bierman of Rockin' Rudy's will be DJing that. We're still taking requests. We've got everyone lined up from we've got from Chuck Berry and the Doors and probably some token 2 Live Crew in there, to K.D. Lang, who was censored, at least in the state of Montana, by the beef money due to her outspoken comments against meat. And let's see, on Sunday then, we will be resuming the regional board meeting. I'm happy to announce is not needed at this point unless something drastic comes up. So we do have some time available Sunday morning for caucuses to get together if there are hot issues that come out of the workshops that need meeting time. We recommend Sunday morning for that. Our closing session gets underway at 10:30 a.m. Sunday. Along with brunch, Joe Van Eaton will be here. Reginald Carter from the NFLCP National Office in Washington, D.C. will be here to hear your comments and answer your questions. We've intentionally designed this closing session as a loose structure to allow for more discussion of hot topics that come out of the workshop, topics that need more time than the hour and 15-minute structure. We also intend on discussing the best of the Northwest, the revisions. We also want everyone to have their questions answered at this conference. So if you go through the workshops, if there aren't workshops offered that answer the questions you really want answers to at this conference, come brunch Sunday, that's your chance. There'll be a room full of experts and hopefully a room full of questions. I do want to mention also an event that we've been invited to. There is a concurrent conference here in town, or a gathering at least. It's the Alliance for the Wild Rockies Rendezvous. Many of the MCAT producers are shuttling back and forth between these two events. All NFLCP conference registrants are invited to a panel starting at 7:45 tonight on the future of the Endangered Species Act. Just bring your badge and show up that's over at the Orchard Homes Country Life Club. Check at the registration desk for more information. And with that, I should probably clam up for a while, let you eat for a while. We'll introduce our keynote speaker officially in about 10 or 15 minutes. Enjoy lunch. Yes, Tom.
Randy, I'd like to announce that the Northwest Bolos will be on sale. Brian Gertman will model for you if you want to stand up and show how attractive and handsome these are. They'll be at the registration desk and they're $15. Everybody needs one.
Randy's wearing one, actually. You can almost see it through his shirt.
Oh, this is the Oregon edition, which the Bolos are a fundraiser for the NFLCP Northwest region, as well as a fashion statement, and very functional. They are table ready. $15 at the registration table. We also will be selling a book about the Age-Wise experience that Tom was too humble to mention. Tom is one of the authors of that, and that's for sale for $20. no access center should be without this book.
Thank
and
you.
No producer should be. And Tom is sharing the proceeds there with the NFLCP. Also, I think I noticed some MCAT t-shirts for sale out there. Conference special, $10. We have new sizes, new colors. The splattered and speckled shirts are $13, like the bright neon. And Eric, stand up, Eric. Nice shirt, beautiful shirt. We thank you for, there are MCAT shirts all over the world at this point. And Alan, hi.
I just want to mention that we're giving something away. This is not being sold. We're going to give away postcards also starting tomorrow morning, if not late this afternoon, for you to mail to your Congress representatives and senators who are also considering further changes in cable legislation. So you'll be given guidance and given postcards, and we encourage you to speak to the people that need to hear us.
Exactly, very important. And I should also relay greetings from Congressman Pat Williams and Senator Conrad Burns from Montana, who wished that they could be here, but were unable to work that into their schedules. Enjoy lunch and see you in about 10 minutes.
You learn what brains and what are screwed up.
And not to interrupt your conversations for too long, but some announcements I forgot to make earlier. Valley Motor Supply supplied a radar detector that is being raffled off. 50 cents a ticket out there, offer void where prohibited by law. Money goes to the NFLCP. To join the NFLCP, you can do that for as little as $15. Join as a friend, and I'm happy to announce that we have at least 10 new members for our region in the NFLCP. And hopefully many, many more before the conference is over. I also would like to thank some folks. There's an entire list of people in the program that we're thanking. I failed to include Missoula Public Library, MQTV, and Hellgate High School for supplying some of the video equipment. So thanks to them. Also, Barbara just reminded me to remind you that at meal functions, we ask you to pull out those colorful little tickets you were given. We're okay for this lunch, but starting tomorrow. And at this point, I'll be right back. It gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Michael S. Mayer, Associate Professor of History at the University of Montana. Quite an impressive and weighty resume here. Bachelor and Master's from Duke University, Master's and PhD from Princeton, distinguished list of fellowships and grants and articles, publications, and we're on the topic of I Know It When I See It, Censorship and the Law. Please welcome Michael Mayer.
Thank you. I hope I live up to the billing. I usually like to start off with a joke, but the First Amendment is pretty serious, so I'll try to be appropriately boring throughout the next few minutes. This talk really is about censorship and about obscenity, because I think that the borderlands between what is publicly acceptable and what is publicly not acceptable is where a society really tests its tolerance. And I think it's important to think first and to understand first that only in this country is this issue controversial. Censorship is the norm elsewhere. Even in countries we consider to be democratic and open, such as Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, censorship is the norm. Government censors regularly pass on plays and movies, and even on political speech. And a good example, probably the most famous, would be the Official Secrets Act in Great Britain. Another good example would be the Race Relations Act, Section 9A of the Race Relations Act in New Zealand, which makes it a crime to say something, essentially, which might offend somebody. In this country, we have a commitment, at least in theory, to free, open, untrammeled speech. The commandment of the First Amendment is clear. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. Yet the freedom to speak, as has been pointed out not only earlier by our mayor, but in table conversation, freedom of speech is not absolute. Slander, libel, incitement to riot are all illegal. Justice Holmes pointed out that no one has a right to cry fire in a crowded theater. But aside from those instances, which are fairly clear-cut, there are other, more difficult examples, and there are pressures against the freedom to speak. The legal scholar Thomas Emerson, one of the leading authorities on the First Amendment, wrote of what he called the powerful forces that impel men toward the elimination of unorthodox expression. Witness the attacks on Salman Rushdie, and witness the attempts to censor the movie just a couple of years ago, The Last Temptation of Christ, which incidentally is an incredibly boring and very pious movie. One particularly contentious and vexing area in which speech, freedom, and the public will come into conflict repeatedly is censorship of obscenity. There are those who want to rid society of what they consider to be a blight. And trying to balance the freedom of expression and these pressures is important. It creates tension. To quote Emerson again, the problem of maintaining a system of free expression is one of the most complex any society has to face. And Emerson warns us that a system of free expression can be successful only when it rests upon the strongest possible commitment to the positive right and the narrowest possible basis for exceptions. Justice Thurgood Marshall, to my mind, unfortunately, is leaving the court, put it more forcefully and more colorfully back in 1969. He said, "If the First Amendment means anything, it means that a state has no business telling a man sitting alone in his house what books he may read or what films he may watch. Yet the public and the courts and the legislatures have long considered obscenity, like slander and libel, to be outside of the protection of the First Amendment. The result is that the law of censorship, especially regarding obscenity, has produced a constitutional disaster area. Part of the problem is that obscenity is at basis a sin. It's not a crime. And as such, it reflects the shifting social, ethical, moral judgments of a community. Let me give you some examples. In 1953, Otto Preminger's movie, The Moon is Blue, failed to receive the motion picture seal of approval because it contained the word virgin. In 1966, 13 years later, the rough language that Elizabeth Taylor spoke in the film version of Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf raised a few eyebrows, but not much fewer. There's a profound difference in 13 years over what we consider to be acceptable public expression. And this change, the pluralistic nature of our society, makes the definition of obscenity virtually impossible. Attempts to define obscenity, attempts to censor it, have led to ridiculous situations. I think all of us would look back with some embarrassment, and maybe not a little horror, at a society that made it a crime to sell Theodore Dreiser's American Tragedy. A bookseller was actually convicted of selling that book. In the 1940s, Massachusetts suppressed Lillian Hellman's Strange Fruit, which is a book primarily about racial tolerance. And as late as 1948, Edmund Wilson's Memoirs of Hecate County was suppressed in New York. Now, only one chapter of that book has much of anything to do with sex, and those of you who've ever read Edmund Wilson are pretty well aware that it wasn't very racy. Throughout the 1950s, Henry Miller's works were unavailable in this country except in smuggled, pirated editions. D.H. Lawrence was unavailable, Lady Chatterley's Lover was unavailable in this country as well. And I think among the most ridiculous results of our attempts to save ourselves from ourselves is Movie Day at the Supreme Court. This is a day when justices and clerks get together in the basement of the Supreme Court building and watch the exhibits in obscenity trials. Justice Harry Blackmun sat through his first movie day, an experience he clearly did not enjoy. And Thurgood Marshall, the court's great prankster, picked up on the notion that many of these films sold themselves as being, quote, educational. And he turned to Blackmun after it was over and said, "Well, Harry, I didn't learn anything, did you?" Blackmun blushed and enjoyed the laugh with everyone else. One movie in an attempt to establish its redeeming social value, began with a doctor, an actor playing a doctor in a white jacket, explaining the psychological illness of nymphomaniac. And the rest of the film is explicitly about the adventures of a nymphomaniac, and it ends with a return to the doctor, and the doctor looks into the camera very seriously and said, "And Laura was never cured," at which point Thurgood Marshall jumped up and said, "But I am," and bolted from the room. Justices Hugo Black and William Douglas never attended Movie Day. In their view, the First Amendment was clear. It said Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of speech. Nothing could be banned. As Hugo Black said, if I want to see that film, I should pay my money like everyone else. And he grumbled on more than one occasion about what he called the Supreme Board of Censors. And he wondered aloud why 9 men, many of them in their 70s, should make judgments about people's sexuality. How did the law get to be this way? How have we done this? Well, that's what I'm going to try to give you today, some sort of legal background and a sense of what the issues are and how they've been addressed. The leading case on obscenity derives from a 19th century English decision, Regina versus Hicklin in 1868. The court held obscene an anti-Catholic pamphlet published by a Protestant electoral union, which was an anti-Catholic organization. The pamphlet was titled "The Confessional Unmasked," showing the depravity of the Romish priesthood, the inequity of the confessional, and questions put to females in confession. The test the judge used in this case was, quote, "If the tendency of the matter is to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral instances, and into whose hands a publication of this sort may fall." Now, the purpose of the pamphlet was religious and political, but the judge admitted that and then said it would suggest thoughts of a most impure and libidinous character. And this Hicklin test was imported into the United States in 1879. And based on that, there were a number of events, some of which you may be familiar with. In the 1920s, the Port of Baltimore banned Aristophanes' Lysistrata. It banned Marie Stopes' Wise Parenthood under the Hicklin test. But the key test in the federal U.S. courts was the United States versus one book called Ulysses in 1933. A judge, John Woolsey, a federal district judge, relied on expert witnesses to sustain the literary value of Joyce's novel. For the appellate court, Judge Augustus Hand ruled that the dominant effect rather than individual passages had to be examined. Let me give you an example. He said that Woolsey's use of expert witnesses, quote, was constitutional. The established reputation of the work in the estimation of approved critics, if the book is modern, and the verdict of the past, if it is ancient, are persuasive pieces of evidence. But at the same time, it essentially affirmed the Hicklin test. But as Hand put it, the erotic passages are submerged in the book as a whole and have little resultant effect. The next major test came a couple of decades later, Butler versus Michigan in 1957. Felix Frankfurter, speaking for a unanimous court, threw out a Michigan statute banning books, quote, containing obscene, immoral, or lewd or lascivious language, pictures, or depictions. The law was intended to protect younger people, youths, from obscene material. But the case arose when one such publication was sold not to a young person, but to a police officer. As Frankfurter put it, the law attempts to quarantine the general reading public against books not too rugged for grown men and women in order to shield juvenile innocence. Surely, he observed, this is to burn down the house to roast the pig. The effect of the law, Frankfurter said, would reduce the adult population of Michigan to reading what is fit for children. And he concluded, we have before us legislation not reasonably restricted to the evil which it is said to deny. The same year, in 1957, the Supreme Court dealt for the first time with whether obscenity itself was protected by the First Amendment. The case was a famous one, Roth versus the United States, which is actually two cases. Roth was decided together with Alberts versus California. Now, Samuel Roth was a man of considerable culture, and some of the material he sold was cheap and fairly tawdry, and other of the material was undoubtedly art. Roth was convicted under a federal statute prohibiting the mailing of obscene materials. Alberts, in the other case, had none of the quality of Roth. He was convicted, though under a California law, which prohibited the circulation of obscene literature which, quote, offends the conscience of the community. The court upheld both convictions. Justice William Brennan, in what I think is one of his darkest days on the Supreme Court, wrote for the majority in Roth. He wrote, all ideas having even the slightest redeeming social importance, unorthodox ideas, controversial ideas, even ideas hateful to the prevailing climate of opinion, have the full protection of the Constitution. But, he went on, obscenity is not within the area of constitutionally protected speech or press. To justify this, he asserted, this court has always assumed that obscenity is not protected by the freedoms of speech and press. And he found that the federal statute banning obscene materials from the mail was therefore, quote, a proper exercise of the postal power. He went on to try to backtrack. He said, any idea having the slightest redeeming social importance could claim First Amendment protection. This led him into a very tricky area. He made a distinction between protected speech and not protected speech, and now he had to define obscenity. He distinguished between sex and obscenity. He said obscenity is material which deals with sex in a manner appealing to prurient interests. And using Webster's definition, he pointed out that prurient means impure in thought and desire, lewd, or having lustful cravings and desires. In other words, he called it, in his words, material utterly without redeeming social importance. It rejected the older Hicklin test, which judged material by its effect on the effect of selected passages on particularly susceptible people. In its place, the court adopted a standard which, in effect, was already in use in many U.S. courts, which was, quote, whether to the average person applying contemporary community standards, the dominant theme of the material, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest. Brennan wrote for a majority of 5. Harlan concurred on Albert's conviction, but he dissented on Roth's. He believes states should be given greater latitude to restrict in this area than the federal government. But Justice William Douglas dissented, joined by Hugo Black. He wrote, the court standard of community conscience inflicted punishment for thoughts provoked not for overt acts or antisocial conduct, and therefore violated the First Amendment. He wrote, speech and writing may be suppressed only when they amount to conduct or are so closely brigaded with illegal action as to be an inescapable part of it. The First Amendment, he said, was meant to block censorship in any form. And he warned that the test today, which suppresses a cheap tract, tomorrow can suppress a literary gem. He concluded, I have the same faith in the ability of our people to reject noxious literature as I have in their capacity to sort out the true from the false in theology, economics, politics, or any other field. Brennan's formulation was very clearly designed to protect Faulkner and Joyce, while at this, or even Erskine Caldwell, while at the same time banning material he thought was obscene and could legally be censored. And his formula wasn't entirely successful. By denying obscenity constitutional protection, he led the court into a morass. He led the court into an area where it had constantly to define what was obscene, not whether or not speech was protected. He'd already determined that obscenity wasn't, but what is obscene? For 2 decades after Roth, the court struggled to define obscenity. The attempt to do so led to great disagreements on the court. There were 13 obscenity cases in the 11 years after Roth. There were 55 separate opinions in these 13 cases. The justices could not agree on what any of this meant. In all of the cases, the justices seemed preoccupied with not protecting speech or even determining what speech is protected, but trying to define obscenity. The Warren Court never established a workable test to separate obscenity from sexually oriented but permissible and protected expression. Black and Douglas, sometimes joined by Fortas, argued that the state should censor no speech. The court overturned censorship of a film version of Lady Chatterley's Lover. But after Roth, the next important decision came in 1964. It was Jacobellis versus Ohio. The case dealt with the licensing of a French film, Les Amants, or the English title was The Lovers. The movie portrayed the story of an unhappy marriage. A woman bored with her marriage and with her life runs off with a young archaeologist, which seems pretty unlikely to begin with. But very near the end of the movie, if there's anyone who's an archaeologist or married to one, I apologize now. And anyway, near the end, there was a fairly explicit love scene, which conceivably might have involved sexual intercourse. Justice Goldberg wrote for the majority. The love scene deemed objectionable is so fragmentary and fleeting that only a censor's alert would make the audience conscious that something objectionable was being portrayed. And Brennan announced the opinion of the court. It was an opinion of the court in which only one other justice joined, incidentally, in which he expanded the Roth test. He said, the test used must be not a local community, but a whole national community standards. And he stressed the need to demonstrate that the material was utterly without redeeming social value. He admitted that the prurient interest standard that he had offered in Roth wasn't perfect, but as he wrote, any substitute would raise equally difficult problems. He went on to say, the mere portrayal of sex is not in itself sufficient to deny material the constitutional protection of freedom of speech and press. So he sharpened the Roth test, and he incorporated Harlan's requirement that the local governments or state governments should be given a broader range than the federal government. Warren, joined by Clark, dissented. Warren wrote, I believe there is no provable national standard, and perhaps there should be none. At all events, this court has been unable to enunciate one. And he said the enforcement of Roth should be left to lower courts. Harlan dissented. Potter Stewart concurred with Brennan, and in it he discussed what he thought was pornography. He discussed hardcore pornography, and in doing so he wrote one of the most famous passages of his long career on the court. I shall not today attempt further to define what kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I never could succeed intelligibly in doing so, but I know it when I see it, and this motion picture is not that. The decision still left state-appointed censors with considerable authority to control speech and press. On the same day, incidentally, as the Jack Bell's decision, the court summarily reversed the censorship of Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. So in the Roth decision, Brennan had attempted to protect serious literature, at the same time to distinguish it from pornography, which he believed should and could be banned. But the lower courts continued to hold obscene material which Brennan knew wasn't obscenity, which he knew was art, and he wanted to address it. And he got his chance when the Supreme Court heard 3 cases in the fall of 1965. The 3 decisions handed down on March 21st, 1966, were Ginsburg versus U.S., Michigan versus New York, and Memoirs versus Massachusetts. In Ginsburg, the court upheld the conviction of publisher Ralph Ginsburg for violating federal postal censorship laws. Ginsburg was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The defense said that the material, standing by itself, did not meet the Roth test of obscenity. The material was the Housewife's Handbook on Selective Promiscuity. It was a presumably fictionalized sexual autobiography of an anonymous female from the ages of 3 to 36. Surprisingly, actually, this appeared to have some literary merit. At least doctors and psychologists testified that it did. 2 magazines were also involved. Liaison, a bi-weekly newsletter that was filled with absolutely smutty jokes and sensationalist pseudo-medical sex stories, and a magazine called Eros, which was a very high-priced magazine for its day, $10 per issue, way back in 1965, think about that, devoted to what he called an intellectual examination of erotica. Brennan again wrote the lead opinion for a 5-4 majority. He never dealt with the defense arguments that this material did not meet the Roth standard for obscenity. What he said was that Ginsburg's advertising was pandering. It had, quote, the leer of the sensualist. And he wrote, the context of the circumstances of promotion, sale, and publicity might be considered as an aid to determining the question of obscenity. And other justices didn't agree. Harlan wrote that only hardcore pornography could be banned. Black entered a vigorous dissent, now on the familiar grounds that he and Douglas had taken to the First Amendment. He said the majority had rewritten the federal law. He said that they convicted Ginsburg of an offense that, quote, Congress never thought about. And he further contended that since there had been 14 opinions in 3 cases handed down that day, no one could know in advance what was obscene, and therefore publishers couldn't even know if they were violating the law, which is one of the basics of American jurisprudence. Douglas, I think, wrote the best opinion, and one of the best of his career. He argued also on First Amendment grounds. He said, the use of sex symbols to sell literature today condemned by the court engulfs another exception on First Amendment rights that is as unwarranted as the judge-made exception concerning obscenity. This new exception condemns an advertising technique as old as history. The advertisements of our best magazines are chock full of thighs, ankles, calves, bosoms, eyes, and hair to draw potential buyers' attention to lotions, tires, food, liquor, clothing, authors, and even insurance policies. The sexy advertisement neither adds to nor detracts from the quality of the merchandise being offered for sale. And I do not see how it adds to or detracts one whit from the legality of the book being distributed. A book should stand on its own, irrespective of the reasons why it was written or the wiles used in selling it. I cannot imagine any promotional effort that would make chapters 7 and 8 of the Song of Solomon any the less or any more worthy of First Amendment protection than does the unostentatious inclusion in the average edition of the Bible. The other case, the second case involving Michigan, was a fellow convicted of a New York law prohibiting the publication of, quote, sadistic and masochistic books. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison after being convicted. Much of the material was regarded as of interest only to homosexuals, and Brennan wrote for the majority again, upholding the conviction, saying that the material was designed for what he called a deviant sexual group, and therefore met the Roth test because it appealed to the prurient social interests of that group. Once again, Black and Douglas dissented. Black wrote, I believe this court is without constitutional power to censor speech or press regardless of the subject discussed. When this court makes particularized rules on what people can see and read, it determines policies, which policies are reasonable and right. And the final case was Memoirs versus Massachusetts. It was about a novel by John Cleland, an 18th century British novelist, called The Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, or Fanny Hill as it's more popularly known. There was no opinion of the court again. The justices splintered all over the place. They couldn't agree. Brennan wrote the lead opinion, in which he was joined only by Warren and Fortas, and in which he said 3 elements had to coalesce in order to produce obscenity. 1, the dominant theme of the material, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest. 2nd, the material is patently offensive because it affronts contemporary community standards. And 3, the material is utterly without redeeming social value. And the last point was the key. The Massachusetts court had said the book need not be unqualifiedly worthless before it can be deemed obscene. Brennan said that's wrong. Black and Douglas concurred in the result only. They took their position on First Amendment grounds. There were dissenters the other way too. White did not agree that redeeming importance was an adequate test. And Justice Clark, Tom Clark, one of Harry Truman's 4 mediocrities on the court, had written very little in obscenity cases. And now he complained that Brennan's use of utterly made it impossible to declare anything obscene. He said, I have stomached past cases for almost 10 years without much outcry. Though I am not known to be a purist, I think he meant a Puritan, he was not an especially brilliant jurist, or a shrinking violet, this book is too much even for me. It is interesting that Clark drew the line at a frank expression of female sexuality. That seemed to offend him, whereas much more explicit works dealing from the other side did not. After this decision, pornographers simply took to including doctors or actors playing doctors at the beginning, or quoting Shakespeare to give it some social or redeeming importance. But since Fanny Hill, no book has been successfully prosecuted, although there have been successful prosecutions of other forms of expression. The following year, the justices finally gave up on their futile attempt to define obscenity. The case was Redruth versus New York. And they essentially decided, they didn't put it quite this crudely, but what they said was anything that a majority of justices said was not obscene was not obscene. And subsequently, the court reversed obscenity determinations against a number of publications if it did not constitute an invasion of privacy, if it weren't forced on people either in their homes, or if there was no state concern to protect minors, or if there was no pandering in the advertisement. Each justice developed his, and in this case it was his, because there were no women on the court yet, own definition of what hardcore pornography was. For Justice White, former football player, the distinction seemed to be that erections, intercourse, or oral sex or anal sex was obscenity. Anything else was okay. His clerks came up with a shorthand version of what was obscenity for Justice White. They said no erections plus no insertions equals no obscenity. Brennan's own private definition seems to have drawn the limit at erections. Justice Stewart had what he called his Casablanca test. He'd been a naval lieutenant in World War II, and as watch officer, he had seen his men bring back from Casablanca and other ports in North Africa locally produced, really hardcore obscenity. He knew what the difference between the hardest of hardcore obscenity was and what usually gets into American movies. It's hard to tell what Thurgood Marshall's standard was. He seemed to be more amused than anything by the whole thing. Black and Douglas took the position that the Constitution was explicit. It protected speech and press. Justice Powell, a cultured Virginia gentleman, was genuinely shocked by his first movie day when he saw Russ Meyer's softcore classic, Vixen. It contained nudity but no intercourse. After viewing it, he was literally shocked, and he told his clerks that he had never seen such a film. He didn't even know such films were made. And this is fairly softcore stuff. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Russ Meyer stuff, but this is not hardcore pornography. By 1970, 41 states had prohibited the distribution of sexual materials to minors. The court upheld that. And back in 1967, Congress had created a commission of obscenity and pornography. In September of 1970, the commission issued its report, which concluded that pornography had little effect on sexual behavior or crime. It recommended that the laws governing the sale and distribution of sexual material be imposed only on the public display of explicit material and on sales to minors. President Nixon immediately rejected the commission's findings. And for 6 years after Red River, the court summarily reversed convictions on a per curiam basis if 5 justices would agree that it wasn't obscene. Within the court, this process became known as red ribbing. And the court tolerated everything but the most hardcore pornography. But the court was changing. With the departure of Black in 1971, Douglas was left as the only absolute defender of the First Amendment. And in 1973, with 4 Nixon appointments in place, the court issued 2 important decisions. The cases dealt with whether states could ban material which consenting adults wanted to see when they walked into a theater or into a bookshop. There was no exposure of these books or films to the public, or to unwilling viewers or to minors. The new Chief Justice, Warren Burger, hated what he regarded as smut peddlers, and he wanted to suppress them. And he got his chance in the famous case, which has become the leading case in the area of obscenity, Miller versus California. Miller was convicted for knowingly violating a California law which made it a misdemeanor to distribute obscene material. He sent 5 unsolicited brochures through the mail advertising sexually explicit material, and one recipient, there's one in every crowd, complained about this. Berger, for a 5-4 majority, upheld his conviction and upheld the law. He reaffirmed the first 2 parts of the memoirs test, the Fannie Hill test, whether the average person applying contemporary standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest, and whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. But he rejected Brennan's memoirs test on the 3rd point, of utterly without redeeming social value. In exchange, Berger offered an alternative which was lacking serious literary, artistic, or political or scientific value. And the trier of fact, in other words, the judge or jury, would apply contemporary community standards, and these standards would be local. Brennan dissented, joined by Stewart and Marshall. Douglas, now standing alone, argued the First Amendment means what it says: Congress shall pass no law. The same day as Miller, in a companion case, Paris Adult Theater versus Stanton District Attorney, Berger, for the same 5-4 majority, held that the state had the power to regulate the showing of obscene material in places of public accommodation. The case came from Georgia. The Paris Adult Theater in Atlanta was convicted of showing X-rated films, including The Magic Mirror, and it all comes out in the end. I hate to think what the second is about. The Paris Theater had no advertising, though, except a sign saying Atlanta's finest mature feature films. It had a sign on the door saying, Adult Theater, you must be 21 and prove it. If viewing the nude body offends you, please do not enter. The trial judge found that pornographic films have constitutional immunity from state regulation because they are shown only to consenting adults, but the Georgia Supreme Court rejected that, and Berger agreed. Justice Brennan now entered a long dissent. Brennan finally saw the light. He finally saw the error of his ways almost 2 decades after the Roth decision. He said that the court has failed to reach a workable definition of obscenity. Therefore, we should accept the report of the President's Commission on Obscenity and stop trying to make these distinctions and bar these. Douglas dissented again, and he bitterly pointed out that Brennan had come over to the side of the angels, but too late. In a related case decided on the same day in Kaplan versus California, Berger held for the same majority that states could constitutionally prohibit the sale of obscene material to anyone, and that included consenting adults. Berger was really proud of his work in these three opinions. In one of the opinions, he bragged that for the first time in 16 years, a majority of this court has agreed on concrete guidelines to isolate hardcore pornography from expressions protected by the First Amendment. But typically, Berger had overreached his abilities and he'd overestimated his achievements. A few weeks after the decisions, a prosecutor in Albemarle County, Virginia, announced that he would prosecute anyone selling Playboy magazine. And he announced that Playboy violated contemporary community standards. Now, I find this a little hard to believe. For those of you who've never been east, Albemarle County houses the University of Virginia. And I don't know if, but I bet you that if you walked into a frat house at the University of Virginia, Playboy would not offend contemporary community standards in Albemarle County. The court then began dealing with the mess that Berger had created with the Miller decisions. In Jenkins versus Georgia, the court overturned the conviction of a movie house operator in Albany, Georgia, who was convicted and fined for showing the movie Carnal Knowledge. If you remember, the film was directed by Mike Nichols. Anne Margaret was nominated for an Oscar. And when the film was shown to the court on movie day, there was little of the usual chuckling and giggling and nudging back and forth by the justices. Thurgood Marshall complained, "I thought we were going to see a dirty movie. The only thing obscene about this movie is it is obscenely boring." On the same day as Jenkins, the court ruled that juries could apply local rather than statewide or national standards. The case involved a conviction for using the mails to carry an obscene ad for a version of the President's Commission's report on obscenity. The jury couldn't decide if the illustrated version was obscene, but the advertising was, and so they struck it down, and the Supreme Court affirmed the conviction. The court, in other words, was sending mixed messages. In one case, it allowed local standards to prevail, no matter how provincial. And in the other case, it said, well, if this local standards may not be good enough, maybe they should be struck down for a broader standard. The Supreme Court added to the confusion 2 years later, in 1976, when the court sustained the use of zoning to prohibit adult theaters in certain areas. In that case, Justice Stevens introduced a hierarchy of values. And for those of you who've watched the Thomas nominations, this hierarchy of values has become part of our law. It was one of the debated issues that Thomas was grilled on. Some speech, he argued, political expression, for example, is fully protected. Some speech, such as fighting words, are not protected. And then there's this gray area in between, subject to more stringent regulation, but not completely banned. And this is the area in which obscenity fell. Stevens used that same test to uphold the FCC's ban on George Carlin's famous routine on filthy words on radio. In 1983, obscenity, or attempts to suppress obscenity, took a completely different direction. The Minneapolis City Council passed an ordinance against pornography based on the theory that pornography violated the civil rights of women. The campaign was spearheaded by two feminists, Andrea Dworkin, the writer and the head of Women Against Pornography, and Catherine McKinnon, then an associate professor of law at the University of Minnesota. She now teaches at Michigan. The mayor of Minneapolis vetoed that measure. But in 1984, the city of Indianapolis passed a law essentially along the same lines. In November of '84, U.S. District Judge Sarah Barker struck down that law. And the case was the American Booksellers Association versus Hudnut. She noted her agreement with the city's concern, reaffirmed the notion that pornography is not protected by the First Amendment, but she found the goal of preventing undefined social damage to women unconvincing. It wasn't specific enough to warrant an invasion on the First Amendment. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals upheld her opinion, and the Supreme Court upheld it by refusing to review it. In May of 1985, then Attorney General Meese appointed a commission on pornography, which held 1 year of hearings, and then in '86 issued a very controversial report, which concluded that there was indeed a causal link between pornography and aggressive behavior. A number of prominent social scientists, including some of those consulted by the commission, charged that it misused, abused, and misinterpreted deliberately data to reach the conclusions they'd wanted to get all along. In 1987, in Pope versus Illinois, the Supreme Court decided courts should ask whether, quote, reasonable persons would find serious value in the work. Now, this is where the constitutional law stands today, and I want you to stop and think about that for a minute, because let me point out one thing. Reasonable persons once considered Beethoven's Ode to Joy indecent. There we have the confused state of the constitutional law of obscenity. In attempting to define pornography, not only has the court failed, but it's produced results which have often alarmed even the writers of the opinions. Part of the problem is that encroaching on constitutional liberty without proof that speech is, as Douglas framed it, either action or so close to action as to be indistinguishable from action, is dangerous. And such proof is very, very difficult to come by in the area of obscenity. Much of the so-called evidence about the harm that pornography causes confuses covariant information with cause and effect. For example, let's say a rapist is found with a great deal of pornographic material in his home. Does that mean that the pornography caused the rape, or does it mean that rapists like pornography? Is there a causal link or not? Is it simply covariant information? There's no real way to determine this. And most of the studies show, in fact, that people who commit violent crimes not only watch a lot less television than the rest of us, but they read a lot less pornography. On the other hand, we have seen very clear grounds for limiting speech. There's a general consensus that pornography is harmful to the development of young minds, and the state has a reasonable interest in protecting them from this. The courts have upheld that. The issue of a captive audience. If you don't want to see this stuff, you should not be forced to confront it. It should not be displayed in public places where people who find it objectionable cannot avoid it. It should not be sent into your home without your request. But basically, I think in evaluating how to deal with this, and all of you, at one point or another, I'm sure do have to deal with this, I think we need to go back to the First Amendment. The First Amendment's command is clear. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or press. And I would agree with the position taken by Chief Justice Stone back in the 1930s. He argued that the first 10 amendments to our Constitution are so central to our form of government, so essential to a free society, that when considering a limitation of these, particularly when covered by the procedural safeguards of the 14th Amendment, courts should take a more active role in judicial review of legislation. He went so far as to argue that the presumption of legislative correctness should be reversed. Now let me explain that. There is something in judicial decision-making called the presumption of legislative correctness. If you challenge the constitutionality of a law, the burden is on you to prove that the law is unjust, because the court should presume that the people's representatives have acted properly. Stone didn't want to overturn this. He simply said, when they start regulating the first 10 amendments, the presumption should be reversed. The burden of proof should be on the legislature to show that there is a just cause for such a violation of the Constitution. And I think that position is a good guideline. It was law for about 10 years until the Cold War, when a number of conservative justices, mostly appointed by Harry Truman incidentally, began to batter away at that on issues of free speech for radicals. The consequences, though, if you start down this slippery slope of regulating speech, can be dire. Let me give you an example. Recently, Florida passed a law which permits anyone offended by a bumper sticker to complain to a police officer, who may then use his or her own judgment in filing obscenity charges. You know what the first arrest was for? Bumper sticker that said "shit happens." The second arrest was for a bumper sticker that said "Russia sucks." Now, many in Russia would probably agree with that. The bottom line is that before the Soviet Union broke up, this was political speech. It wasn't terribly enlightened or articulate political speech, to be sure. Certainly not sophisticated, but it was political speech nonetheless, exactly what the First Amendment was designed to protect. One woman was pulled over by an officer for a bumper sticker which said, "Humpty Dumpty didn't fall, he was pushed." This is what happens once you start allowing somebody else to regulate your freedom of expression. And right now, we face a very serious threat, I think, with legislation pending in the United States Senate, introduced by Senator Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky. McConnell is, okay, television or not, McConnell is a Neanderthal. He is a thug who has absolutely no appreciation of the First Amendment. He's been joined in supporting this by a number of feminist organizations, and I would ask both sides of this, the right-wing Republican and the feminists, to look at who they have crawled into bed with and see if it doesn't alarm them. The basic problem we have is who's going to make these decisions for us. Are we willing to allow someone else to make decisions about what we read, what we watch on television, what we see in movie houses? The problem with obscenity is we don't know it when we see it. We know what's obscene to us. I know what's obscene to me. There are lots of things that are, and there are lots of things I would never watch. But I don't know what's obscene for someone else, the person sitting next to me. One person's obscenity is another person's art and another person's harmless junk. We live in a pluralistic and complex society. There has to be room for individual judgment. And the framers of our Constitution understood that, and they framed the First Amendment accordingly. Our Constitution is based on the idea that every person must choose for him or herself what is obscene, what is politically wise, what is religiously acceptable. We trust the American people to make decisions about politics, about religion, about the economy. I think we can trust the American people to make decisions for themselves in these areas as well. I would conclude with the observation that once someone else begins to make these decisions for us, we've lost a basic, perhaps the basic component of our democracy. And I hope there will be questions, and I'd like, if there are any, I'd like you to, or comments. Don't throw things, please, but short of that, I'd be glad to take any comments or questions. Yeah?
I'd like to hear you elaborate some. The amendment says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say that the states shall make no law.
But we have a 14th Amendment, remember, and which applies, which is the so-called under incorporation has applied the protections of the first 10 amendments to the states as well. And the court has interpreted the 14th Amendment, which applies specifically to the states, to incorporate all of the basic freedoms of the first 10 amendments. So that dodge, which was used incidentally to get around anti-desegregation ordinances, it was attempted, that dodge was used to perpetuate segregation, which the court struck down repeatedly. The 14th Amendment covers the first 10 amendments in its application to the states, so that that doesn't particularly work. State governments have to live by the Constitution as well as the federal government as well, is basically what the 14th Amendment has been construed to say by the courts. And again, this is an issue on which Thomas and Bork before him and Souter and so on have been grilled by the Senate Judiciary Committee because they're concerned about that analysis. And I don't think anyone has rejected that. I mean, even Bork has no problems with incorporation. He's fairly extreme in his judicial philosophy. It's a good point. Anybody else? Yeah?
Has there ever been any cases involving public access that have gotten to the Supreme Court?
Not that I'm aware of that have gotten to the Supreme Court. I know there are a number of cases of access. Most of them, incidentally, that I'm aware of, don't deal with obscenity. There is one in which these people, this sort of bedroom party these people had, I think it was in California. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Where these people had this show on cable access, and they sort of jumped around, not wearing very many clothes, and the local governing body got very upset about it, but it did not go very far up the judicial system. The most highly controversial cases that deal with public access thus far, and the ones most likely to require adjudication by the Supreme Court, are cases involving hate speech on cable access by Nazis and skinheads and other groups of that sort. So the short answer is no. In either case, the Supreme Court decided about cable access. That's a very touchy area because it involves, as does commercial broadcasting, the right of the airwaves, and there is an invasive component, and other people are, well, you can turn it off, so it doesn't have to come into your home. And it's a very, very complex area, and it's one which I'm worried how this court will adjudicate. I mean, I find it fascinating that today liberals are using the Miller decision to try to defend speech. I mean, now there's a weak read for you. This was a cutback on Roth, which, as I argued, I think was a cutback on free speech. That's how far things have gone in the other direction. And I think it's a terrible mistake on the part of say, the American Civil Liberties Union to try to use Miller as a defense of speech, because if you do, you've given away 2 strikes before you start out. But anyway, no, there hasn't been anything along those lines that's gotten to the Supreme Court, although watch, I mean, I think it will. Anybody else? Okay, how about we'll go left to right, yeah.
Do you see obscenity or the whole political realm as being the greatest threat to freedom of speech?
That's a difficult question. I see it as a significant threat because there's sort of a thin end of the wedge kind of operation here. It's one most people hate, violent pornography, and it's one where you can sell. A demagogue like McConnell can go out to the people and say, look, isn't this terrible? Look at kiddie porn, look at violent pornography, and everybody say, yeah, let's get rid of it. And so in that sense, it is dangerous. But I think suppression of political speech, while more overtly contrary to the First Amendment, is also a threat, and we're seeing it, to me, the most horrifying threat to free speech in abstract rather than obscenity is coming not from the Neanderthal right, but coming from our own college campuses with attempts to suppress people who have conservative or non-politically correct views on campus. And that really horrifies me because it's worse than the McCarthy era in a real sense, because in the McCarthy era, the troglodytes tried to suppress free speech on campus. Well, you expect them to do that. That's their job. That's what troglodytes are for. But you don't expect to see people who should know better doing this, and yet we're seeing that on college campuses all over the country. And I think that actually may be an even greater threat than the use of pornography by cheap politicians to try to encroach on the freedom of speech. Yeah, there was a,
Yeah, there's a precedent that I've always been curious about why nobody brings this up in connection with obscenity or these other television issues, that it is illegal to advertise cigarettes on television. It's illegal to advertise hard liquor on television. It's perfectly legal to manufacture cigarettes and liquor, to sell it, to advertise it through other means, only not on television. And I find myself arguing with myself that, sometimes I almost feel it would be reasonable to ban certain types of things only on television. So you're not banning producing this, there's no criminal penalties involved, you're not banning producing the materials, you're not banned from distributing or advertising or showing them to anyone that wants them, but that television might have more stringent requirements. As I say, like a lot of other people, I'm sure we get into arguments about with ourselves about how we might feel about that type of restriction.
well, there are clearly restrictions on television. I mean, television, how many uncut movies recently have you seen on television? Television won't show a lot of things. They redub the language, they cut the more graphic sex, and even sometimes the more graphic violence, although they're obviously much more lenient about violence than sex on television. There are regulations, and those, because that's not open speech, but I have a problem with the argument about the invasiveness, and I'm sort of conflicted on this too, as I mentioned earlier. Yes, it is invasive. It's projected into your home whether you want it or not. But the ultimate censor is you sitting into that. You can flip the channel, or you can actually take the radical step of turning the box off, and then you're not subjected to it anymore. So I think it's a very difficult area. But clearly, Congress, because the people in theory own the airwaves, Congress has a much greater latitude for regulation of expression over those airwaves and into your home, and that's very clear. What is legal to show in a movie theater would not be acceptable to show on television. And beyond that, I don't have, yeah.
Do you then put cable into a separate category from broadcast as differentiated, as in magazine ads are not excluded from selling cigarettes or hard liquor? This is a purchased service.
Exactly, but it's also increasingly universal, and you can also make the argument, again, that the people, if they don't own the actual cables, have right to control access to those cables, and in almost every area they are regulated in some way, which would be precedent for that. I would hate to see, I go back to Frankfurter's position about making everybody watch what is suitable for 5-year-olds to watch, and especially on cable, where, as you said, you pay for it, you bring it into your home, you have the choice. The regulation becomes tougher, yeah.
And collateral fact, what's the view of fair warning? If you are told, as we've had cable programs which will perpetuate one of the probably 8 or 9 different styles, where it finally says, look, if you're so damn stupid that you're going to be offended and you still have it on this channel, it's your own damn fault, don't talk to us. I mean, you eventually get to that point.
Well, essentially, that's what you see. I don't know if you noticed, but Arts and Entertainment, a cable service, has been doing that recently. They've been sort of pushing the envelope of broad, basic kinds of services, or expanded basic kinds of services of cable television, and they have disclaimers. If you don't want to see this, turn it off. The new Encore channel does that. And even public television does it. They show I, Claudius. And at the beginning of the last showing of I, Claudius on Spokane Public Television, they had, there is stuff here that is not intended for minors. This is intended for mature viewers. If you don't want your children to see it, turn it off, change the channel. And if you don't want to watch it, turn it off, change the channel. I think that fair warning is an important issue, because we go back to the point that Frankfurter raised. I mean, as conservative as Frankfurter was on these issues, and he wasn't willing to use the First Amendment very broadly. But as he pointed out, you can't reduce the entire viewing public, or in that case, reading public, to what is acceptable for elementary school children. I mean, otherwise we will be reading C. Jane Run, Run, Big Run for the rest of our lives. And then, presumably, we want a little bit more sophisticated discourse than that, although maybe not. Yeah.
I'd suggest that we've already done that with broadcast. With broadcast is geared toward an 11-year-old mentality, and so that our mass media is now geared towards, a very low level, and the only alternative is cable. But I'm sorry about jumping on a comment. I'd also suggest that we bring cigarette ads back to TV and ban 30-second political ads. I think they're more obscene. But anyway, I'm kind of curious about your feelings on the court as it is. You've talked about what it was in the past. There's been some fairly dramatic, or there proposes to be some fairly dramatic changes, and some of your comments about what you see as in the future.
Well, I really don't know. I think that I am concerned, as I said, when we've gotten to the point where in these cases, such as the 87 case from Illinois, the liberals are looking back to Miller to protect speech. We've gone a long way down that slippery slope, and I think we're going to go farther down. Or there's a possibility, and there are people on the court, Scalia, Rehnquist, Kennedy, who have very little respect for precedent, and who have very little respect for the First Amendment, and that alarms me. I don't include Souter in that group. Souter seems to me to be a highly professionalized judge who's willing to respect precedent. I don't have any idea how Clarence Thomas would vote on these. To me, this is a very important issue, yet it's one which the Judiciary Committee raised and then let drop, never really grilled him on this. And I don't think that he should have said how he was going to vote on these things, but we really don't have any idea of how he views the First Amendment. We do know that, going back to a question that was raised earlier, he supports incorporation. The incorporation of the first 10 amendments into the 14th as it applies to the states, but which is a proper question. Beyond that, I'm not sure. And Thomas, incidentally, for those of you who don't know, the Judiciary Committee split 7-7 on a motion this morning to report favorably, which killed it, and then voted 13-1 to report it to the Senate, but with no recommendation. So I would say there won't be more than 30 votes against him in the Senate. It's just a guess, but I don't think many people want to vote against a black man who's literally pulled himself up from poverty and so on. So I don't know. Assuming he's on the court, I really don't know. I don't think his nomination affects the court profoundly in any area except the right to abortion. I think it will have a profound effect there. But the decisions aren't 5-4 anymore. I mean, the decisions are 6-3. And Thomas is just one more vote. He's not a swing vote on any issue except perhaps abortion. And so on these areas, I don't think Thomas per se is going to make much change. But I think there's an extremist wing on the court that has very little regard either for precedent or for the first 10 amendments. They love the Constitution, but they're not crazy about those things that were tacked on afterwards. And that does concern me, especially since there is always a public that can be gotten up in arms about this. We shouldn't be watching, kids shouldn't read Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn, or they shouldn't be reading Fanny Hill or Catcher in the Rye, or you can always get the public outraged about this sort of thing. And this is an easy area for demagogues to pick up on. There was a... No.
Same question about how you view the future of the court. The sorry days where we look at the Nixon court and say those were the good old days.
Well, in a sense, it's not. I mean, that is true. Berger was a conservative, but look at Nixon's appointment. Powell and well, Rehnquist turned out to be an extremist, but Blackmun not only turned out to be liberals on this book, but turned out to be fairly moderate jurists by any objective standard.
I was going to ask if you saw anything in these people's backgrounds that might cause them to see the light. Now they got a lifetime job. They don't have to worry about their paycheck. And I think you've already said about 3 of them there's no hope.
And they've been on. I mean, they've got a record. I mean, Rehnquist has been a narrow construction as to the First Amendment ever since it's been on the court, and this is going on 20 years now. I mean, this shouldn't surprise anybody. In the case of Scalia, we've got enough of a track record that's pretty clear. In the case of Kennedy, there isn't much at work there. He just votes away the two more powerful intellects on the extreme right of the court tell him to vote, and he's very dependable and will be dependable well into the next century. He's young and healthy. But beyond that, it's very hard to say, and I think that many of these people are tempered by the responsibilities that they face. And certainly, Hugo Black lived down his past as a Klansman. Felix Frankfurter shocked everybody by being a conservative on civil liberties issues during the Cold War. It is hard to know. I think that a fellow named Ray Solomon, who at the time was working for the American Bar Foundation, wrote an article a number of years ago now, in which he was talking about basically presidential nominations to the Supreme Court and upper federal courts from the turn of the century up through Franklin Roosevelt, in which he said there are basically three typologies of appointments. Some presidents appoint justices on the basis of policy. They want, good examples would be Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, Lyndon Johnson. They want liberal or conservative justices who will adhere to a certain vision of policy, and they appoint for that reason. A secondary would be politics, where you sort of appoint for political reasons. And the typical example of this would be Harry Truman, who appointed his political buddies from the Senate or people from regions where he thought it would help the Democratic Party himself politically, without much regard either to policy or to the professional qualifications. And then the third type would be those presidents who appoint primarily for professional qualifications, who are interested mostly in sort of the highly qualified resumes. And good examples of that would have been Taft, which made sense. He'd been a Supreme Court justice and so on. And Eisenhower would be another. And I think when you get a president committed to professionalism, you're most likely to get a surprise. Reagan got relatively few surprises because he was appointing ideologically. Roosevelt got a couple, but they were surprises, and very few given his total number of appointments. He was appointing ideologically. Same with Lyndon Johnson. Basically, Roosevelt and Johnson wanted liberal judges. They appointed liberal judges, and they got liberal results. Same, Reagan wanted conservatives and got conservative results. The ones who get surprised are the ones who rely more on abstract professional qualifications. And I don't know about Bush. The first appointment seems to fit that professionalism sort of model. The second one is a little more cynical politically, but I think since the Bork nomination, the whole process has become incredibly more cynical. So it's very hard to say, and it's hard to say exactly what impact these people being on the court will have on these people. I think O'Connor surprised a number of Reagan conservatives. And so it's hard to know, but my own personal view is that it doesn't look that good in these areas. I think we're going to see a constant whittling away. In my estimation, the two most danger-fraught areas of seeing established precedent overturned are Roe versus Wade, the area of abortion, and the other is the separation of church and state, the unbreachable wall that Hugo Black talked about that's set up by Abington School District and Engel versus Vitale is being breached on a fairly regular basis. They're not breached, but chipped away at on a fairly regular basis by this court. You take enough chips out, eventually the thing falls down. And I think those are the two areas that concern me most. I saw another hand someplace. Yeah?
Yeah, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on a subject that you just barely touched on. And that was, I think, what a lot of people who are involved in community programming are going to be faced with, and the courts are too, are the difference between the First Amendment rights of individuals with access to the technology and versus the corporate First Amendment rights of the companies who actually own the equipment and the organization or the corporation. So can you elaborate a little bit on that and where you see that going?
I really don't know, and I mean it's so untested in terms of of black letter established precedent. I think it really is up for grabs. It's a very difficult line to draw, and I mean I assume that you're also talking about the right, say, of cable access to deny access. Is that the sort of issue you're?
Not necessarily. I view that kind of as a different issue. But what some of the court cases that are moving through the district courts anyway are not so much, are a lot of times are between, whether the community or whose First Amendment rights are greater.
that's really, in my view, perhaps, which isn't going to be the mainstream of jurisprudence for the next 10 years, I promise you, is that you're really not talking about conflicting First Amendment rights. You're talking about property rights of a cable company to protect its viewer base and its charter from the city or whatever it is against the rights of someone who wants to get on, particularly someone with a noxious sort of message that he or she wants to send, skinheads or whatever. I mean, people aren't. I don't think anyone would worry so much about a communist the way they would have 10 years ago, and the whole thing's falling apart there. But it's easier to suppress the extreme right anyway because it's so small and they're so hateful that it's easy to say, well, these people are beyond the bounds. And I assume that's the kind of issue you're talking about. As far as I'm concerned, that whatever they may be, they have the same right to speech as everyone else. Speech is not free and it's not protected unless the most hateful members of society have a right to express their thoughts in the same way that everyone else does. Otherwise, you've got censorship. And once you start, who makes these decisions? And I see it more as a conflict between property rights and free speech rather than rights to speak and free speech. Because after all, whoever it is, whatever the charter, whoever holds that cable, the controls of that cable access, are controlling what goes on. Their job is essentially to open the airwaves to people, not to close them. But I don't think that's going to be the direction jurisprudence takes. I don't know. It's hard to tell. I saw a bunch of hands. I just saw another one.
Besides the basic, changing of the Supreme Court, we've seen a tremendous number of the lower court appointees from the Reagan era. And I don't know if there's been enough of a track record, but how do you see either what has existed or what will exist in the future in terms of the impact of the lower court?
Well, I think there are two things to keep in mind. One is the lower court judges follow the Supreme Court. That's their job. They don't make law. They interpret, and they can interpret narrowly or broadly, and they can do a lot of things. But lower court judges are and have to be, they must be guided by the Supreme Court, irrespective of their views. They don't have, this is what some people have said, say, I don't mind Clarence Thomas on the appellate court, high though it may be, but on the Supreme Court there's nothing regulating his views. And the same argument was made with Kennedy and with Bork and so on, Souter. And so there is a difference there. The other thing I would point out is that this is not news. I mean, not in the sense, and not only that everyone knows that a large part of the judiciary now has been appointed by Republicans because they controlled the executive for such a long time with that 4-year lapse. The same thing was true after in 1952 or after 1952 when the Republicans assumed the presidency. Roosevelt and Truman had appointed nothing but Democrats to the federal judiciary. And in 1953, something like 85 or between 85 and 90%, I think, of all federal judges had been affiliated Democrats before they went on the bench. And the Republic survived. And I think that the same thing is going to be true here, especially if Bush wins another term. It's going to be a long, long stretch of Republican presidents, and most of the federal district court judges and appellate judges will be appointed by Republicans. Presumably, most of them will have been Republican in orientation before going on the court, but they're still fairly narrowly bound. An appellate judge, even, and especially a district judge, who starts handing down decisions repeatedly that are overturned by appellate courts or by the Supreme Court, is in almost an untenable position. And you saw this in the 60s with a number of segregationist federal district judges who were repeatedly overturned by the Fourth and Fifth Circuits. I mean, eventually, it's pointless, and you lose any semblance of credibility as an honest trier of fact in the court of first instance. So they are fairly rigidly bound in that sense. That I think both in terms of historical precedent and in terms of realistic impact, I think that's it's true and it's probably not great, but it's not unusual. This is what always happens when we have a long stretch of one or the other, and I don't think it's an enormous threat to the Republic or anything. I saw another one over there. Yeah.
Given the present climate, what about the recent article in the New York Times to the effect that there is some talk of revising the entire Supreme Court appointment process? Do you see any hope?
Well, I don't think there's much chance of that, and I'm not sure it would be a good thing. The process that we have now is not an especially good one, but people forget it has never been an especially good one. We look at the Judiciary Committee today And you have to hold your head and think, my God, look at the people on the Judiciary Committee. And look at the moronic questions they often ask, and look at how ideological and intellectually dishonest they often are. It wasn't any different back in the 1950s. It wasn't any different back at the beginning of the Republic, really. And so I think I think we often romanticize what was when we're dissatisfied with what is. What we've got now is pretty much what we've had all along. The process is, in some ways, more overtly political. And in that sense, it's alarming. Television plays a role. Political action committees that actually mount campaigns for and against nominations to the court play a role. And the intellectual dishonesty of these 30-second spots and 60-second spots about Supreme Court justices can be really frightening. And I think they do tend to corrupt the process. But it's always been intensely political. George Washington had a nominee rejected because of his opinion on Jay's Treaty. Now, that may not really turn you on or off, but it was a hot topic back in those days. And Tyler had five nominations kicked back, essentially because the Congress didn't like Tyler, which is an eminently sensible position. He wasn't a very likable man. But I mean, this isn't new. And I think technology is in some ways made it worse. I think in this case what we're seeing is a split government. The fact is that Democrats still control Congress and the Republicans have managed to control the executive. And the Republicans, because they control the executive, have the appointment process, and the Democrats are upset about it. And so this has become increasingly contentious. And that's not surprising. It's part of a larger historical trend rather than the quality of people who are appointed today or the quality of the Judiciary Committee or the Senate itself. I mean, yeah, it would be a lot nicer if we had better people appointed to the court. It would be a lot nicer if we had better people on the Judiciary Committee. But we never have had, and don't let anybody fool you any different. For 20 years, James Eastland ran the Judiciary Committee with the help of other Southerners like Olin Johnson and Sam Ervin, who did everything they could through that process to thwart desegregation, to perpetuate a system of segregation and suppression in the South. And that's not an admirable record that we have to look back on. None of this is really new. And the interesting thing to me is the hypocrisy of it all. Back in the 50s, liberals were saying, well, no justice should have to state his positions before going on the court. And now they're going to vote against Thomas because he won't state his positions. And of course, the conservatives were trying to get these people, what is your position on segregation? It's the most important issue of the day. And today they're saying, oh, it's awful to ask anybody to go on record with his positions before he goes on the court. I mean, the complete reversal of opinions. Positions simply because of reversal of situations. And which is, I think this is what makes the public cynical, the blatant hypocrisy of the process. If they were honest about it and said, we don't like this guy's opinion, we don't want him on the court, that's one thing. But the attempt to reach for high moral ground when in fact they're arguing a fairly narrow political base, it turns a lot of people off. And I think anyone who's aware of, say, those sorts of reversals. And in fact, I gave a talk on the Thomas nomination of the League of Women Voters here in town. And I began with a quote about a senator talking about a black nominee saying he should not be made to state his positions on these controversial issues before he goes on the court. It was Ted Kennedy talking about Thurgood Marshall back in the 1960s, because Marshall's positions on desegregation and on the Miranda case were red flags to conservatives who wanted to grill him on this. So I mean, the reversal of positions, these aren't really people arguing about principle. They're arguing about their ideas and they're trying to frame it in principle. They seem often hypocritical or silly because of that. But again, see, none of this is really new. Anybody else?
Thank you. Informational, inspirational. The ideas I'm taking back are, first of all, movie day at the Access Center, and maybe for the Off the Wire, the regional newsletter, a column featuring, what was that, pseudo-medical human sexuality information? In any event, thank you. We're right on time. We are going to be heading into workshops at 2 o'clock in 15 minutes. I do want to mention two more things about the timing of our gathering here. We're heading into Banned Books Week, which is highly appropriate. Libraries are celebrating that. We should all celebrate that. My wife wears a shirt that says, there's something in my library to offend everyone. And as access managers, I think we could all wear a shirt adapting that. We're also getting close to National Local Cable Programming Week. This past Monday, Mayor Kemmis read a proclamation, presented a proclamation here mentioning some of MCAT's accomplishments. And for this conference, we scheduled some cable casting around the conference schedule, some of the most requested stuff. Archbishop Desmond Tutu tonight, the International Choral Festival tomorrow. This was based on TCI's assurance months ago that the Red Lion would have cable in long before now. I found out yesterday that that's not the case, and I know it's not that any huge cable corporation would ever say anything that's untrue, and I know it defies the imagination, but we're not here to cable bash, as I mentioned. There are MCAT schedules in your packets. There are also MCAT bumper stickers in your packets. I ask you to be careful where you drive with them. Hearing Mike's stories, these Russia sucks gets you in trouble. Yeah, watch out for Florida. And with that, unless there are any other announcements, let me remind you that we're heading into workshops. For track A, we have field production tips in the Lewis room. For track B, the value of access in the Clark room. And for track C, Access Center informational exchange in the Canyon room, which is across the lobby. Thank you.